The Gilded Cage Part 1. The promise of gold. Rochelle St. James clutched the velvet box, its weight a strange counterpoint to the lightness in her heart. Inside lay the promise, the symbol of a love she'd dreamt of since girlhood, a band of gold. It shimmered under the soft glow of the antique lamp in her mother's parlor, a beacon of hope in the twilight of her single life. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Julian Thorne. Julian. His name tasted of old money and whispered promises. He was everything her mother, bless her pragmatic soul, had ever wanted for Rochelle. Stable, successful, and attentive in his own reserved way. He'd swept Rochelle off her feet, or rather, gently escorted her into a whirlwind romance. It was a courtship conducted with the decorum of a bygone era, filled with whispered compliments, escorted walks in manicured gardens, and the occasional chaste kiss that left Rochelle more curious than ignited. Rochelle had always been a dreamer, her head filled with stories of grand passions and sweeping romances. She'd grown up in the shadow of her mother's quiet strength, a woman widowed young and fiercely independent. Her mother's love was a sturdy oak, providing shelter and unwavering support, but Rochelle yearned for something more, something that shimmered like the gold band in her hand. Julian represented that more. He was the key to a world she'd only glimpsed in books and films, a world of elegant dinners, philanthropic galas, and a life free from the quiet anxieties of her mother's modest existence. He was her escape, her chance to write her own story, a story she envisioned as a fairy tale, complete with a Prince Charming and a happily ever after. The wedding was a spectacle, a symphony of pastel hues and hushed whispers. Rochelle, radiant in her ivory gown, felt like a princess in a dream. As she walked down the aisle, her heart fluttered like a trapped bird, a mix of excitement and a strange, undefinable unease. Julian waited for her at the altar, his expression composed, a polite smile gracing his lips. He took her hand, his touch cool and formal, and she told herself it was simply nerves, the weight of the occasion. They exchanged vows, the words echoing in the grand hall, binding them together in the eyes of God and society. The gold band, now on her finger, felt warm against her skin, a tangible symbol of their union. As they kissed, a brief, perfunctory touch of lips, Rochelle's heart remained strangely still. She told herself it was just the beginning, that the real fire would ignite later, in the intimacy of their honeymoon. Part 2. The empty room. The honeymoon suite was a study in opulence, a gilded cage. Silk drapes adorned the windows, a crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, and the four-poster bed, draped in lace, seemed to command the room. Rochelle, dressed in a delicate nightgown, waited, her heart a drumbeat against her ribs. She'd envisioned this night 1,000 times, the culmination of their budding romance, the moment when they would truly become one. But Julian never came. A note, written in his precise, elegant script, lay on the bedside table. Dearest Rochelle, an urgent matter has arisen. I must attend to it immediately. Please forgive my absence. Julian. Rochelle read the note again, the words blurring through her tears. Disappointment washed over her, a cold wave that extinguished the last embers of her romantic fantasies. She felt a strange disconnect, as if she were watching herself from a distance, a character in a play she no longer understood. She spent the night alone in the vast, empty room, the silence amplifying her growing unease. The gold band on her finger felt heavy, a shackle rather than a symbol of love. She stared at it, its gleam mocking her naive dreams. The room, with its luxurious trappings, suddenly felt like a prison, a gilded cage where her hopes and dreams were slowly suffocating. The following days were a blur of polite excuses and strained smiles. Julian remained distant, preoccupied with his business affairs. He treated her with courtesy, but the warmth she'd sensed during their courtship had vanished, replaced by a polite indifference that chilled her to the bone. They occupied the same space, shared meals, engaged in polite conversation, but a chasm had opened between them, a vast emptiness that Rochelle couldn't bridge. She felt like a ghost in her own life, moving through the motions of being a wife, attending social functions, hosting dinners, all while her heart ached with a loneliness she'd never known. The memories of their brief courtship, once cherished, now felt like a cruel joke, a phantom limb of a love that never truly existed. Part 3. The whispers of doubt back in her childhood home, her mother noticed the change in Rochelle. The light in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a shadow of sadness. She moved with a listlessness that worried her mother deeply. "Rochelle, what is it, child?" her mother asked one evening, her voice soft but firm. They sat in the same parlor where Rochelle had first admired the gold band, the antique lamp casting long shadows across the room. Rochelle hesitated, unsure how to articulate the emptiness that consumed her. "It's Julian," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's different. He's not the man I thought I knew." Her mother took her hand, her touch grounding. "Marriage is a journey, Rochelle," she said gently. "It has its ups and downs. Sometimes, the path is not as smooth as we imagine." "But Mama," Rochelle's voice broke, "I feel so alone. He's there, but he's not there. He's like a stranger in my own house." Her mother listened patiently, her eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and concern. She'd seen the shift in Julian's demeanor after the wedding, the subtle coolness that had replaced his earlier attentiveness. She'd suspected something was amiss, but she'd hoped, for Rochelle's sake, that it was simply a misunderstanding, a temporary hiccup in their relationship. "Have you talked to him, child?" she asked. Rochelle shook her head. "I've tried, but he always deflects, says he's busy, that it's just stress from work." Her mother sighed. "Sometimes, Rochelle, silence speaks louder than words. You deserve to be happy, child. You deserve to be loved." Her words resonated with Rochelle, a truth she'd been trying to ignore. She'd been so focused on fulfilling her mother's expectations, on living the fairy tale she'd constructed in her mind, that she'd blinded herself to the reality of her situation. She'd married a man she barely knew, a man who treated her with polite indifference, a man who had locked her heart in a gilded cage. Part 4, Breaking Free. The turning point came during a charity gala. Rochelle, dressed in a shimmering gown, felt like a mannequin, a beautiful object on display. Julian, as always, was charming and attentive to others, but his interactions with her were perfunctory, devoid of any genuine warmth. As she watched him circulate through the room, laughing and engaging with other women, a wave of anger surged through her. It wasn't just anger at Julian, but anger at herself, for allowing herself to be trapped in this charade. She'd built her dreams on a foundation of sand, and now, the tide was washing away everything she'd thought she wanted. She slipped away from the crowd, seeking refuge in a quiet corner of the ballroom. As she stood there, alone with her thoughts, she noticed a woman sitting nearby, her face etched with sadness. Rochelle recognized her as Julian's secretary, a quiet, unassuming woman named Clara. Clara looked up, startled, as Rochelle approached. "Mrs. Thorne," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. Rochelle sat down beside her. "Clara," she said softly, "is everything all right?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "It's Mr. Thorne," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. He's not who you think he is." Rochelle's heart sank. She knew, deep down, that something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed by someone else, someone who clearly cared about her, was like a punch to the gut. Clara went on to explain, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian had been involved in an affair for years, a long-term relationship with another woman. The woman he'd left the honeymoon for. The urgent business matter was a rendezvous with his mistress. He'd married Rochelle for appearances, to solidify his social standing, to appease his family. She was nothing more than a convenient ornament, a beautiful addition to his carefully constructed life. The truth hit Rochelle like a physical blow. She felt a wave of nausea, followed by a profound sense of betrayal. The gilded cage she'd been. The truth hit Rochelle like a physical blow. She felt a wave of nausea, followed by a profound sense of betrayal. The gilded cage she'd been trapped in wasn't just a metaphor, it was a carefully constructed reality, designed to keep her a prisoner of his deception. All the polite indifference, the constant absences, the lack of intimacy, it all made sickening sense now. She'd been so blinded by her romantic ideals, so eager to play the role of the perfect wife, that she'd failed to see the truth staring her in the face. Tears welled up in her eyes, not tears of sadness, but tears of anger, of a righteous fury she'd never known she possessed. She'd been naive, yes, but she wasn't stupid. She'd been manipulated, used as a pawn in Julian's twisted game. And she wouldn't stand for it any longer. She thanked Clara for her honesty, her voice trembling slightly but firm. She stood up, her head held high, and walked back into the ballroom, not as the demure wife of Julian Thorne, but as Rochelle St. James, a woman on the verge of reclaiming her life. She found Julian amidst a group of his cronies, laughing and gesturing expansively. He turned as she approached, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Rochelle, darling," he said smoothly, "where have you been?" Rochelle looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "I know, Julian," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the polite chatter. "I know about Clara, about your mistress, about everything." Julian's face paled. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some flimsy excuse, but Rochelle held up her hand, silencing him. "Don't," she said. "Don't insult me with your lies any longer." She took off the gold band, the symbol of their supposed union, and held it out to him. "This," she said, her voice laced with contempt, "is nothing but a gilded cage. And I'm done being your prisoner." She turned and walked away, leaving Julian standing there, speechless, surrounded by the whispers and stares of the onlookers. She walked out of the ballroom, out of his life, and into the cool night air, feeling a sense of liberation she'd never experienced before. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and social fallout. The divorce was messy, but Rochelle was determined. She wouldn't be silenced, she wouldn't be intimidated. She'd been hurt, deeply, but she wouldn't let it define her. She moved back into her mother's house, the sturdy oak that had always been her shelter. Her mother welcomed her with open arms, no judgment, just unconditional love. Rochelle found solace in her mother's strength, in the quiet rhythm of her childhood home. She started working again, dusting off her old aspirations, her dreams of a career that had been put on hold for her ill-fated marriage. She rediscovered her passion for art, for painting, for expressing herself through color and form. She started taking classes, reconnecting with her creative spirit, the part of herself that Julian had tried to suppress. The healing process was slow, like the gradual mending of a broken bone. There were days when the pain of betrayal would resurface, a dull ache in her heart. But Rochelle refused to dwell on the past. She focused on the future, on building a life for herself, a life filled with purpose and meaning. She learned to trust again, to open her heart to new possibilities, not with the naive idealism of her youth, but with the wisdom gained from experience. She discovered the true meaning of love, not the fairy tale romance she'd once craved, but the deep, abiding connection between two souls, a connection built on respect, honesty, and genuine affection. She found it not in a whirlwind romance, but in the quiet companionship of a friend, a man she'd known for years, a man who saw her, not as Julian's ex-wife, but as Rochelle, the woman she was becoming. Years passed. Rochelle's paintings gained recognition, her art celebrated for its emotional depth and vibrant colors. She built a successful career, a life that was fulfilling and meaningful. She found love again, a love that was real, a love that nurtured her soul. The gold band, once a symbol of her dreams, now lay forgotten in a drawer, a relic of a past she'd outgrown. It no longer held any power over her. She'd broken free from the gilded cage, not just the one Julian had built, but the one she'd created for herself, the cage of her own illusions. She'd learned that true love wasn't about fairy tales and grand gestures, but about honesty, respect, and the courage to be true to oneself. And in the end, she found her own happily ever after, not in the arms of a Prince Charming, but in the strength of her own heart. She had traded the gilded cage for a life painted in her own vibrant hues.